Hi, I have another great pattern to share with you today. This one is called Fall Fields of Four. It was actually a mystery quilt series that I taught a couple of years ago, and today I want to share it with you. It's a great pattern for autumn. My name is Lori Dickman, and thank you so much for stopping by my channel, Quilting with Lori. If you like the quilting tutorials that I share with you, please go ahead and like and subscribe, and make sure you comment as well. I love to hear from my viewers. I love the information that you share with me, and I love to be able to share more information with each one of you. So today I'd also like you to check out my description box below for PDFs. There are going to be a number of PDFs that you're going to want to save to your laptop or download or print so that you have those available as you work through this pattern. The pattern is free and all of the parts and pieces are available for you, from the yardage requirements to the templates, etc. So make sure that you either save those or download those or print them out so you have them. I'm also going to share with you in the description box a link to my lecture on speedy solutions to cut and organize your scrap stash. I do have a corresponding book, in fact a couple of books that go with that lecture, but it really does help you to know how to cut, sort, store, organize, and then use your scrap stash. There's a number of patterns available in them. So if you haven't yet had a chance to watch that video, please make sure you check out that link below. Now let's go ahead and get started. Okay, as I mentioned before, in the description box there are PDFs, and I'm going to try and link them in the order in which you need to make sure you print them out or save them. The first one will give you an overview of the class, just the information that I had shared with my students when I conducted the mystery quilt class a few years ago, but it does give you an overview of the yardage requirements, so you'll want that. And then the second PDF that you'll want to print out is step number 1, and it's 3 pages, and you want to get that printed out because it's going to share with you how we are going to put together this first block, which is the maple leaf block. The quilt has 8 maple leaf blocks and 8 hourglass blocks, and I'll show you how each of those is put together. You can make these as scrappy as you want, or maybe you just want a dark, a light, and a medium, and you're going to use those 3 values for the whole quilt. Totally up to you. I love to use my scrap stash, and so let me share with you what I've pulled. Before I do that, I'm going to share with you just some supplies that might be helpful to you. If you do have this clover loop pressing bars, they are very helpful for making our stems when we applique our stems to our square here. If you don't have them, it's not a problem. I actually pressed mine without even using them, but they are very handy tools to have. So if you have those, you might want to take advantage of those. And also we are going to need some sort of a square up for 4.5 inches for each one of these squares in this block. It's got to square up to 4.5 inches. I do have these OmniGrid rulers out on my website. They're very handy to have. Even if you have like a 12.5 inch ruler, that will work, as long as you can square up a 4.5 inch and it has that diagonal line. There's so many square up rulers out on the market. I'm sure that you have something that will work. So this is the block we're going to be creating. Let me show you what I've pulled for this block. So it requires that you pull a number of squares in the lights, in the 4.5 inch lights, 5 inch lights, and 4.5 inch brights or darks. I'm going to call these my leaf prints, and then 5 inch leaf prints. And so these are squares that you'll want to pull. That will look great for your leaf prints. Or maybe you're using a yardage, and that's fine. And then you're also going to need a 1.5 inch width of fabric, maybe 3 strips from a fat quarter, or width of fabric from your yardage, whatever you're going to use. I have a brown here that I'm going to use, and that's what I'm going to use to create my stem. So let's see how this is done. So to create the maple leaf blocks, we're going to start by creating our stems, which we're going to be appliquing onto a 4.5 inch light square for each of the 8 blocks. So I've cut a strip of fabric 1.5 inch wide, and I'm going to use brown for my stems. You can use whatever color you choose for your stems, but you're going to need 6.5 inches in length for each of the 8 blocks, 1.5 inches wide. And I'm going to do 2 of these for you today. The first thing you're going to do is take your fabric and sew a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. You're going to press it so that, or you're going to fold it so that the fabric is wrong sides together with right sides out. In the case of this brown fabric, either side is correct, it doesn't matter, but we want the right sides out, facing out. So let's do a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. Whoops. And I've got about a 13-inch segment here of fabric. So I'm just gonna sew a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. I actually sewed it so that it's almost just an 1/8. What you want to do is cut the seam allowance down so that there's only about an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance there. And I've actually accomplished that in my sewing together of this. Now, if you have a clover, this is the clover loop pressing bars. These are plastic bars in various sizes. You can pull out your 1/4 inch clover loop, and then you can place this in here. And the goal is to maneuver the fabric so that you can press this at your ironing board so that the seam allowance itself is in the back of the fabric, and the stem will look very neat from the front and you cannot see the seam allowance. So that's the goal of this. If you don't have a clover pressing maneuver, you can certainly just press it like this, take it to your ironing board and press the seam allowance is definitely on the back so that when you're appliquing it to the front of your block, you do not see the seam allowance. And again, I've sewn the seam allowance so that it's basically an 1/8 of an inch. But if you do a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, you might want to trim that seam allowance so that it's an 1/8 of an inch that's left. And then I'm going to take this to the pressing board and press this, and then I'll show you how we're going to applique it to the squares. Okay, so now you'll see I have pressed this length of fabric so that the seam allowance is tucked behind, just like that. And there it is. And I didn't even use the clover, I just simply used my hands to maneuver the seam allowance to the center back. Gave it a nice good steam, and I'm ready to applique the stem onto my squares. These are 4.5 inch light squares. You're going to want to choose 8 of your 4.5 inch light squares. And if you do this in assembly line fashion, it will go quite quickly. You'll want to pin the stem fabric across the square diagonally, just like this. Pinning it will just help to ensure that it stays in place as you maneuver it up to the sewing machine. And I'm not going to pin this one because I'm going to take this up. So I'm going to take this up and I'm going to do this in assembly line fashion. I'm going to stitch, applique stitch on one side all the way down and then follow up all the way up on the other side. I'm using a white thread. You might want to use a thread that matches your applique so that it's not so visible for you. So hopefully you can see as I'm stitching here. Here we go. And simply edge stitching as close as you can to the edge of the stem. And then I'm going to flip and I'm going to sew up on the other side. Using some really pretty embroidery type thread might be a nice thing to do on this applique step for the stem, if you had a nice brown or gold applique thread. All right, so it's ready to go here. Now what I want to do to cut these apart is just to square them off at the edge, and what this will do is just eliminate a little bit of bulk on that end. I don't want to cut much, but just a little. So let me grab my ruler and this, and I'm simply cutting a tiny little bit off the end there, which will allow this just to remove a little bit of bulk when we sew it together. And I would go through and do all of that on all of your squares, just a tiny little bit, as you see there. So that is the stem that is needed to be applied to the 4.5-inch light background square. Now let's put it together with the half square triangle units. So now we're going to make the half square triangle units that are going to create the maple leaf points in our maple leaf block. And so you're going to take 2 lights in 5-inch squares and 2 of your brights or darks, the leaf prints, we'll call them the leaf prints. And you can certainly make this as scrappy as you want. You don't have to use the same ones. I just happen to choose the same 2 light 5-inch squares and the same 2 dark or leaf print 5-inch squares. And what we're going to do is, again, just make those speedy half square triangles, placing them right sides together, drawing a line from corner to corner. There's one. I do all of this in assembly line fashion, so I would take all of my 5-inch lights and all of my 5-inch leaf prints. I would put them right sides together. Then I would take all of them and draw a line, and then I would take them all to my sewing machine and sew a scant 1/4-inch seam allowance on both sides of the drawn line. So here we go. And when I say a scant 1/4-inch, I'm talking a thread or 2 less than 1/4 of an inch. So there's 1, and here's 2. And again, you would do all of your blocks at the same time. I'm just demonstrating one entire maple leaf block today. So you've come down all sides on the one side, and you're going to go back on the opposite side. Scant 1/4-inch seam allowance. Then you're going to cut them apart. First we'll do that, and then we use a ruler and cut them all apart on the drawn line. And you've created 2 half square triangles. There's 1, there's 2, here's 2 more. Here is 3 and 4. So these are going to be used to create the points in your maple leaf block. What we need to do right now is go press them to the dark, and then we're going to square them up to 4.5 inches. I'm going to go press them, and I'll be right back. Okay, what I'm going to do now is just square up. I've already squared up 3 of the 4 half square triangle units. They're all squared to 4.5 inches exactly. And this is the last one here. I'm using a 4.5-inch square up ruler. You can use this, or 6.5, or even a 12.5 if that's all you have, or you can even use your rotary mat and rulers and follow the lines on the mat. But it's very convenient to have some sort of a square up ruler. I do have these out on my website if you're in need of one. But this is a 4.5. There's a 45-degree line across the diagonal point here, and we're going to line that up with our seam allowance. Center it on the square. There's not a whole lot that has to be trimmed away, but it's important that that is trimmed away so that each and every square is exactly 4.5 inches square. So as you can see, there's not a whole lot that has to come off. And from all of the squares that I've done here, it was just a little bit that had to come off, but all 4 of them are now squared up to 4.5 inches. So now we're going to lay out each of the maple leaf blocks, and it's basically a 9 patch. So you have your half square triangles, and there's the total of 4 half square triangles that I've just created. Here is the square that has the stem, the maple leaf stem on it, and of course that's going to go at a diagonal to fit the maple leaf. Now this one is kind of scrappy. Maybe you don't want it so scrappy, maybe you want everything to be matchy-matchy. That's totally you know, your preference, whatever you choose to do. I've got some green in here, and here are some orange. This makes it match a little bit better. And then of course there's one 4.5 inch light. So for every maple leaf block, you're going to have a half square triangle, light. These are all 4.5 inch squares. A leaf print, half square triangle. The maple leaf stem, leaf print, half square triangle. We're going to sew this together, a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then we're going to press it and square it up to 12.5 inches. So here's my Scrappy maple leaf block. I've sewn it 3 rows of 3, so it's a 9 patch. And what I've done once I've pressed it, I've pressed the seams toward the center in most cases, but press so that it lays nicely for you, but I've tried to press toward the dark and toward the center as much as I could. And then I'm going to I squared it up to 12.5 inches. What you want to make sure of is that you are allowing a 1/4 inch at every point that is available there to sew this block to the other blocks. If you don't allow that 1/4 inch seam allowance there, you're going to cut off your points, and you don't want to do that. And here's a couple of other areas that you need to make sure you allow that 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I show pictures of that in the PDF, so take a peek at that and just make sure that you've pieced it in such a way that you do have that 1/4 inch seam allowance on all of those areas so you don't lose your points. And make 8 of these blocks, and then we're ready to make the hourglass block. All right, we're going to take a look at the second block here, and this is the hourglass block. And don't forget to download the PDF for step 2, which will help you to understand how to put the hourglass block together. And I'll demo that here in just a moment. But this is what it will look like. You'll notice that the darker squares are going through the center, and this is the hourglass portion of it. So let's see what I've pulled to create this block. So you're pulling 7-inch brights or darks. These are what I'm going to consider leaf prints, if you will, for part of my hourglass block, in 7-inch lights. So I have a variety of lights and a variety of brights or darks, and these are all 7-inch squares. I've also got 32 each of the 3.5 inch lights and 32 of the 3.5 inch brights. And so those I've pulled from my scrap stash. Now let's see how this goes together. For the hourglass block, we are going to simply make some 4-patch units, and you'll use 2 of the light 3.5 inch fabrics or squares and 2 of the leaf print or dark or bright 3.5 inch squares to make our 4-patch, and then we're going to square it up to 6.5 inches. So I'm going to go ahead and piece that 4-patch. I won't make you watch me do that. Everybody knows how to do a 4-patch, but I'm going to sew that together, and then I'm going to square it up to 4.5 inches, and I'll be right back. All right, so this 4-patch unit has been sewn together with 2 darks and 2 lights. They're all 3.5 inch squares. Sewn together, it actually creates a 6.5 inch unit. And You do want to square them all up, make sure that all the 4 patches are in fact 6.5 inches, and this unit does measure 6.5 inches square, and I've pressed it, trying to press everything to the dark as much as possible. So the 4 patch, you're going to need 2 4-patch units per hourglass block, and you're going to need 2 half-square triangle units for each hourglass block, and we are making 8 hourglass blocks for this quilt. Now let's see how to make the half-square triangle unit for the hourglass block. So for your half-square triangle units for the hourglass block, you've pulled 7-inch squares. One a darker or a bright square that's 7 inches, and one is a light square that's 7 inches. And we're going to make our half square triangle units the very same as we did for the maple leaf block. You're simply going to line them all up, right sides together, light on top of a dark or a bright, and then you're going to draw a diagonal line from corner to corner on each of them, and then you're going to stitch a scant 1/4 inch line on each side of that. I won't make you watch that again, but I'm going to go ahead and do that for this block, and then I'll show you when I get to the point of cutting it and opening it up. So I have sewn the half square triangle unit. As you can see, I've sewn on each side of the diagonal line. You can see it better on the dark side here. And now I'm going to cut it on that drawn line to separate it and create 2 half square triangle units. All right, here is one unit, and here is the other unit. And then what we need to do with all of the units for the hourglass block is to trim them up, square them up to 6.5 inches. There's not a whole lot that has to come off of each of these, but that must be done. So the first thing I'm going to do is press this to the dark, press the seam allowance to the dark, then I'm going to come back and square this up. I'll be right back. So I've just squared up my 2 units here to 6.5 inches. Not a whole lot of fabric that had to come off, but a little bit did come off, just this much for these 2 units. Very important that that get removed. Now let's lay this block out in the formation that it's going to be sewn together. So here we have the hourglass block laid out, and it's basically a 4-patch. There's 4 units here. There's a 4-patch unit up here, a 4-patch unit here. The darker fabrics are going at a diagonal here. And here are the 2 half square triangle units that we made that squared up to 6.5 inches. In fact, every quadrant here is a 6.5 inch unit that's going together. And make sure that you put the darker fabrics together in the center to create this hourglass block. So now I'm going to piece this together, and then I'm going to press it and square it up to 12.5 inches. I'll be right back. So here's the completed block squared up to 12.5 inches. Make sure again that you have the 1/4 inch seam allowance available on your outer points there, so that when you sew this block to the next block, or to the blocks around it, you won't be cutting off your points from the hourglass. And you want to make 8 of these blocks and 8 of the maple leaf blocks. I'll include a link in the description box below as well of this photo. This is how you're going to lay out your quilt center. These are the 16 blocks that you've created. 8 are maple leaf blocks and 8 are the hourglass blocks. And you're going to simply lay them out in 4 rows of 4 and sew them together, making sure that your diagonal rows are going as shown here, and that your maple leaves are tilted in this direction for each of the blocks and for each of the rows. Okay, so next we're going to take a look at how to piece the borders, and make sure that you download or save or print the PDF, which is step number 3. You want to make sure you've got that available. For the fabrics that I'm using for my borders, I have a mustard color for the long triangles, I have a light, and then I have this for the outer border and the 4 corners. And you'll see in a moment how I'm putting those together. Now we're going to piece the border. It's a points in, points out pieced border, and we're going to, in my case, I'm using plastic template film, and I've traced my templates, which I've printed. Make sure that you download and save and then print out all of your PDF templates. These must be printed at 100%. So if your printer defaults to fit to page or anything else, make sure that you change it so that it prints at 100% so that your template sizes are accurate. And so I have done that. You will need to actually tape 2 of these together. You'll see that little portion there has to be taped together with it. And I've done that here. You've seen where I've taped it, and so it makes a complete B template, and this is called the long template. You'll see me refer to that as the long template. Make sure that you print out your PDF as well with all of the instructions so that you can follow along as I go through this. And all of the PDFs are in the description box below. So I've made the long template, and I have made the end units. This is the end unit A and the end unit B. These are mirror images of each other, and they just finish off the borders on each end of the row. I am using this mustard for my triangle, and then the light background, and I've simply cut 4.5 inch width of fabric strips to lay my templates onto and to cut them out. So let's see how this is done. So what I've done here is I've lined up my light fabrics and my dark fabrics that I'm going to use for these triangle pieces. I've lined them up so they're all in rows here as close as possible, and I've taken my long B template and I've placed it on top there, and I've simply traced that template onto this, and you can continue tracing by just flipping it here and tracing it again, tracing here and there, and then you can simply cut these out. I would prefer to use a ruler in my rotary cutter instead of cutting on the template. And the reason I prefer to trace it onto the fabric instead of cutting around this is it's very easy to distort my template, and then my template is no longer accurate, and the next time I make the pattern I've got distorted templates as well. So I personally like to trace the template onto the fabric and then use my ruler and rotary cutter to cut them out. And you're going to need a total of 16 light long triangles, and you're going to need a total of 12 darker fabric triangles. So with your medium or bright fabrics, you're going to cut templates, the C and the A templates. They're basically mirror images of one another. There's A and there's C. And if you fold your fabric in half, as I've done here, and just use one of those templates and trace it on there and then cut it out, you'll actually end up with one A and one C because they're mirror image. So then you won't actually have to trace all of them, but you do need 4 the A end units, and you need 4 of the C end units. So you'll need to make sure that you cut enough to have an end unit for both ends of each border row. So here you'll see I have 1 A end unit and 1 C end unit, and you need to cut a total of 4 of each of these so that you can end each of your border piece rows. Let me show you how those are put together. So you're going to lay out your border pieces like this. So I've got my end unit here and a light triangle. And you can see this if you follow along on your PDF. There's photos that show you step by step how to put this together. And we're going to follow that bottom photo here. So I'm going to take this end unit and I'm going to place it right sides together on the light triangle, and I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and that's basically from that point to that point. So let's bring it up here and do that. And for the time being, I'm just going to finger press these units. And I'll press it open, pressing that seam allowance to the dark. So we have an end unit here with a light. Now we're going to take a dark and we're going to lay that just like that. And we're going to flip it on to the light. And again, stitch from that point to this point. So I'm going to bring it up to the machine and stitch that. And again, I'm just going to finger press this, pressing the seam allowance up to the dark. And you'll notice here that I have enough room there for my 1/4 inch seam allowance. That's very important. You've got to have that. So we now have end unit, a light unit, a dark unit, and we're going to continue across the border sewing 4 of the light triangles with 3 of these darker triangles. And then we're going to finish off each end with these end units. So here's a completed row, and it's hard to show you the whole thing, but here we have an end piece, and then we have 4 of the lights and 3 of the darker units that are sewn together, and there's another end piece. And you got to make sure that you've got the 1/4 inch seam allowance at the top and the bottom here, so that when you sew this border on, you're not cutting off your points. That's very important. So you're going to make 4 of these identical to this, 4 of these identical to this. But of 2 of them, you are going to place a 4.5 inch block, a cornerstone on each of them. So the top and the bottom border unit will have a 4.5 inch, and in my case I'm using this green, and I'm going to sew that on there and stitch it on. So the top border and the bottom border will have these cornerstones that will finish off the quilt. And then you're going to measure the quilt and obtain your correct measurement for the outside 1.5 inch outside border that you'll be using. Let me show you that on the quilt itself. So here is my quilt, and I've got the 16 blocks sewn together on the center. And you'll notice when I put the border on, I made sure that the light triangles were touching the center, and the dark triangles are toward the outside border. That's really important. It gives the appearance of the center of your quilt floating, and I think that's a very neat look. But of course, this is your quilt, so you can put it together any way that you want. And then on the outside, the top border and the bottom border will have those 4.5 inch squares that you see up here in the corner. And that's important to have those to finish off the top and the bottom. And then on the entire quilt on the outside edge, what I did after I pieced the whole thing and had the pieced border on it entirely, then I measured across from top to bottom, got that measurement for the outside borders, measured across from center side to side, and that's the measurement that I used to attach the outer 1.5 inch border and the lower 1.5 inch border. That helps to make sure that your quilt is squared up and it will hang nicely. I would love to see photos of quilts that you've put together. You can certainly email me, contact me through my website, and you can send me photos, and love to see the quilts that you make. I do have a video that I'm going to link below as well of some of the students who were part of my mystery quilt class a few years ago, and their finished pieced tops, so that you can get some inspiration from that. And I will include also in a moment here some close-ups of the quilting, so that will give you some idea on how to quilt your quilt. I did a lot of free motion quilting, feathers and so forth, and paisleys and leaves and just had a lot of fun. Did some ruler work on the outside, and I'll get a close-up for you here in just a moment so that you can get some ideas on how you can quilt the quilt. Please let me know in the comment section if you've made this or if you're planning to make it. Maybe you actually took this mystery quilt class from me back in fall of 2020. I'd sure love to hear from you. And thank you so much for stopping by my channel. Thank you for taking the time to hear my tutorial today. I sure hope that you enjoyed it and that you'll participate in this wonderful Fall Fields of Four quilt. Thanks again. Have a great day.